the 6i, episode 4. This is going to cover the applications of the modified Promis software that Michael RICONOSCIUTO made when the software tapes were delivered to Wackenhut by Peter Wiedniks. After communicating for over 4 years with William Hamilton, the president of Insular Inc., I managed to get in contact through the cousin of Michael RICONOSCIUTO to be able to have direct communications by letters and correspondence with Michael RICONOSCIUTO himself while in prison. And I was very fortunate. He took me into his confidence after he found out my background was similar to his in physics, mathematics and programming, similar backgrounds, and I understood the technologies, and he felt so relieved because no one understood it. And so he really gets very frustrated. I thought I was smart until I met Michael RICONOSCIUTO. He's a genius. He is a genius in physics, engineering, software and advanced mathematics. And I take my hat off to him because the chairman and director, Harry Fair of DARPA, when interviewed, said that he considers Michael RICONOSCIUTO as a national treasure. And so clearly Michael knows really what Echelon does, an NSA, and over nearly close to 17 to 18 years now in communications, almost on a weekly basis. My recorded interviews with him, correspondence. Michael's recall is instant and, more important, can answer questions on very advanced areas of physics, mathematics and programming. But more important is that he has been able to trust me, to allow me to prove the evidence. And the evidence that I uncover in Australia, he doesn't have access to. I've contacted many programs in defence and security, which are still classified top secret, and people won't talk about it, but they couldn't work out how I knew about it and confirmed the things that Michael was talking about. So this is when we kick off our discussions. He says the first application is for tracking Soviet nuclear submarines. Now Michael, after I'd proven myself technically and he got to trust me, he gave me the full transcripts of his court case. And there are things in there that no one has ever seen and would understand. And that convinced me that it was Rupert Murdoch's company, Computer Power Group, that sold the CIA's modified Promis software to the Australian government, because it's the technical components of it are only known by me, given that I worked for Murdoch's company and his research companies here in Australia, and I know what contracts they had, and I then did my own investigations and interviews with key people in government who were able to confirm that I was absolutely right. So the first application was for tracking Soviet nuclear submarines, and it really was developed and modified for the whole of NATO forces and US Navy in order to be able to coordinate war simulations and also their efforts to track all nuclear targets. And it was installed on the US Trident submarines, and Michael confirms the type of computers. There are special computers that were used. You can't put a big VAX computer onto the submarine, but there were alternatives, and I'll document those in the episodes as well. But he said it was integrated into the missile fire control and command systems. And he also explained to me that there were certain computers called the VAX 11780s for Intergraph that were special, and that's really for Echelon applications. And so the most important thing here is that this episode will prove that not only is Michael telling the truth, but because John Hopkins was my partner from 1995 to 1999, my research confirms that Earl Bryan's company, I've got all the brochures, his company was contracted to develop the missile fire control command systems for the US Trident submarines with Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. And I also have the resumes and have met and have the communications with them in another project where they destroyed me, where they're the architects of Echelon, and they personally were responsible for the integration of the missile fire control command systems for the Trident submarines. So I've proven that independently, and it substantiates that Michael said that the Promis software tapes, the COBOL tapes, were delivered across to Wackenhut by Peter Wiedniks for Michael to modify them for Dr. Earl Bryan and his company Hadronic. The next application, Michael said, is that it really was modified then for Swift banking. And it's for following all of the transactions of movement of covert funds through the automatic clearing houses. And it was being used by Earl Bryan, and it was installed at Citibank at their subsidiary called Transaction Technologies Inc. And I have all the evidence of the corporate documents and the work that they did and their contracts with Systematics in Singapore. But this is going to be critical proof of what Promis was really doing when being sold to foreign governments. And it allows for CIA, NSA, DIA to move covert funds through all the banks for arms, drugs, money laundering, and particularly the movement of currencies and security notes and gold bullion certificates. We are talking about a hidden economy that's bigger than our economy. And Citibank, I want you to remember that everything, all roads of Swift banking lead to Citibank. And that's critical for my story on being destroyed twice. And then Michael says that the modified Promis software was sold to Australia, and they renamed it the Lean software. Now, not only did he tell me that, but it's in the transcripts of his court case in 1991. And no one knew what that meant. It turns out it's the law enforcement access network software that was sold by Rupert Murdoch's company to the Federal Attorney General, the Australian Federal Police, ASIO, ASIS, our Foreign Intelligence Group, DSD, which hooks up with Echelon, with Defence, and it was put into the corporate affairs for the tracking of land and also company certificates and shares, and also it was put into AUSTRAC, which is our equivalent of FinCEN, which tracks all transactions of banks over $10,000. No one knew that. Second part there is that it was also modified for a specialized architecture of intergraph, and so the average person won't understand how Echelon really works. And that is that the architecture of the computer itself is what's transmitting hidden information, hidden signals so far below the floor of the noise that you can't detect it. And that's what Michael's expertise is. I've interviewed his research associate, and he was dumbfounded when Michael had a red phone that wasn't connected, no wires, and you pick it up and there's a dial tone, and you could communicate on it, and he ran his spectrum analyzer to see if there was any RF, any radio frequency synchronous signals, but he couldn't see anything. And he couldn't work it out. And he said that's when he was blown away and wanted to join. And that was Ray Levass. I've got all my interviews recorded with him. And he is verifying that when he was introduced to Michael by Robert Mayhew and Robert Booth Nichols to work with him. That was Michael. He was years ahead in the use of orthogonal functions for the transmission of orthogonal function signals, which is now used in today's communications with phones with encryption, that you can't detect it. It's not using a standard carrier frequency, and so you can't pick it up with a frequency spectrum analyzer. But this is how the hidden signals were transmitted. And it goes back to technology that NSA was using years before it becomes publicly available. And what's very important is that as soon as I got that legal proof, one, Michael wrote it in his letters to me, and then when I got the transcripts of his court cases in 1991, he provided that testimony about it was renamed the Lean software and sold to the Australian government. So there's the definitive proof. But what was important is Rupert Murdoch sold that to the Federal Attorney General. It was put into AUSTRAC. It was put in all of the government agencies, and it illegally integrated all the databases across all agencies of intelligence, defence, law enforcement, our courts, our land titles, our corporate registration, and AUSTRAC, health records, everything. And when it was discovered that it had been operational since 1987 to 1991, when Michael's in court testifying that Promis software was sold, a full federal parliamentary inquiry into the Lean software was launched, because there was growing concerns of parliamentarians and the public that this is illegal. They're linking all databases that belong to the citizens, their private information, and spying on them, which was in breach of the federal privacy and confidentiality legislation. So this is a complete podcast that will show you definitively. Now, I've interviewed the director responsible for it, working for the Federal Attorney General, and he told me categorically he was taken to AUSTRAC by Computer Power Group, Rupert Murdoch's company, for them to demonstrate their Lean software operational and installed at AUSTRAC. So Michael's testimony was not known by anyone else about the significance. And why that's important, Current Affair TV program in Australia did a full documentary about the fact that the Promis software had been sold by CIA to the Australian government and ASIO and intelligence agencies, which they denied. And it turns out that they were already using it back in 1987, and it's hooked in for Echelon, and it's hooked in for tracking money and records of all citizens and their transactions. And so the documentary from Current Affair Australia they interviewed Bill Hamilton, and then they interviewed Michael RICONOSCIUTO in prison, where he's telling them that it was sold to foreign governments so that CIA can spy on the governments. And this goes back to the original concerns back in 1975, the Falcon and the Snowman, with the concerns raised by Christopher Boyce, is that he was seeing all of the echelon communications and interception of what they were doing. And he said he was just so upset and angry. He was seeing what CIA was doing to the Australian government. And that was the dismissal of Prime Minister Gough Whitlam and Dr. Jim Cairns to be set up and destroyed and removed. Pine Gap is on Australian soil. Australians cannot go into it. It's like its own country on our soil, and it's spying on us, our own country. And Michael was modifying the software at the request so that CIA could use it. And now he's assisting me to expose it. For over 20 years now, we are now able to prove that it was Rupert Murdoch's company that sold it to the Australian government's intelligence agencies to spy on Australian citizens.